This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and this is episode 664 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. We've got an early mailbag episode this week because of my schedule, and there's an earlier draft guide update coming as well. But before getting into these mailbag questions, I want to remind you about the Establish the Run draft kit. Establish the Run has rankings for any fantasy format you might be playing in, and they continuously update as news breaks. You also get access to Evan Silva's top 150, and along with it, a change log that you can read to see why players are moving up and down his draft board. It's a great way to make sure you understand why players are ranked where they are, and the goal is to help you make better decisions, not tell you who to pick. And if you're into best ball drafting, their strategy, rankings, and insight can help you out a ton with roster construction. I know that I've personally learned a lot from their analysis. Established Run gives you a different perspective on fantasy football than I do. I think the combination of my work and theirs can help make this draft season a successful one. So head over to establishthorun.com and purchase their draft kit, and when you do, use promo code JJ for a 10% discount. That's promo code JJ. Also, there's some big news at FanDuel. FanDuel has an all-new mobile gaming app, FanDuel Face-Off. With FanDuel Face-Off, you compete in quick, fun games against other real people for real cash. It has all sorts of games that you're familiar with, like a home run derby, Wheel of Fortune, puzzle and strategy games, and more on the way. Contests are action-packed and last between 2 to 5 minutes, so you can play on your couch, waiting in line, during a commercial break, wherever. And you can do it on your schedule. Plus, you can practice for free anytime. Whether it be head-to-head, multiplayer, or larger tournaments, FanDuel Face-Off has something for you. Plus, in most contests, you'll be matched against players of a similar skill level, so you're never totally overmatched, even as a beginner. Face-Off is also tied to your FanDuel account and wallet, so you can easily use your daily fantasy funds or sportsbook winnings in the app. Visit FanDuel.com/faceoff or download the FanDuel Face-Off app in the Apple App Store today to get in the game. Age and location restrictions apply, void where prohibited. See FanDuel.com/faceoff-terms for terms and conditions. The first question this week is from Twitter. It's from @AlStocco. It says, is there a reason to feel confident about any of the first round running backs this year? They all seem to have serious availability concerns. Are star wide receivers less likely to get injured? You'll see less injury to wide receivers than running backs, yeah. But I don't see how this season is necessarily any different for running backs than previous seasons. The fact of the matter is, the hit rates for running backs in rounds 1 and 2 of fantasy drafts, it's way, way better than any other round of the position. You're inherently taking on an injury risk. But that's the nature of the running back position. It's unfortunate, but it's how it is. So I would feel confident in early round running backs because early round running backs have historically been way better bets than how backs perform at later parts in your draft. The drop off at wide receiver is there as well, but it's not as steep. That's what this is about. There's a very, very big drop off after the first couple of rounds. This is a huge reason why a hero RB approach can be really impactful in fantasy football. There are charts in the late round draft guide that really show this too. You can see how often a player hits a different points per game threshold by ADP. And those charts really show the drop off that I'm talking about at running back. The next question this week is from Patreon. It's from Chris. It says, hey JJ, wondering how pre-draft stud Khalil Shakir and the evolving Bills depth chart have you feeling? Is he still above a riser like Pacheco in your mind? Thanks. So this shouldn't be a surprise to anyone who's been reading or following my work this offseason, but my 3 highest rostered players this year from this year's rookie class, and this is across my dynasty teams, Kyle Phillips, Isaiah Pacheco, Khalil Shakir. I'm generally going to have a higher percent rostered number for players who are drafted later. And I always gravitated to those 3 later in drafts. So I like Khalil Shakir quite a bit. One of the comps in my model was actually Cooper Kupp. And that's one of the reasons I was on him pre-draft. And then he fell to Buffalo, and it's a team that sort of has a vacancy in the slot. And I figured Shakir, a slot guy, could play in the slot. But the Bills seem to be trying him out everywhere. And that's great. That's smart. Get him reps all over the field. The fear is that they're doing that because they feel comfortable enough with what they already have. And we've seen them take it slow with younger wide receivers in the past. Look at Gabe Davis. So I don't think Shakir necessarily has to be on your season-long fantasy draft radar. I think he's someone that if you see some positive signs, if he starts seeing more snaps in season, then you can immediately snatch him up off your waiver wire. you'll be ahead of your league mates in knowing that he's a really good player. That's why a lot of prospect work can still be really good for season long, because you understand these players. You understand who they are as players. And so when they start to do a little bit more in their offense, you know whether or not to snatch them up. If you're in a super deep league, fine. I'm just speaking to what's going on in most leagues here. He's almost always going to go undrafted. It's just a different dynamic in fantasy at wide receiver versus running back. That's why Pacheco is a more important piece right now to your redraft puzzle. The next question this week is from Twitter. It says, any thoughts on mid-round handcuff/handcuffing ambiguous backfields? Personally, I am loving getting Damian Harris in the 5th and then Ramondre Stevenson in the 7th or 8th. It feels like a locked-in RB2 with upside the rest of the season at relatively little cost. So I would advise against this pretty strongly. I wouldn't say that the cost here is relatively little if you're spending a 5th rounder on Damian Harris and then a 7th or an 8th rounder on Ramondre Stevenson. There's still a pretty significant opportunity cost there. And it's a decent cost when you know that you're not even going to be starting either of those guys together this year, more than likely at least. Your goal in fantasy football is to squeeze out as many points out of one lineup slot as you possibly can, because there are always going to be replacement level players. This is why fantasy analysts like myself, we're very into 2-for-1 trades, where you're getting the one because that one is often the best player in the deal. And that means that you can optimize your starting lineup more by getting more points in one singular spot. I also don't really understand the idea of focusing in on New England in that backfield in hopes to get an RB2 with upside. You can do that with singular backs in the middle rounds if you want to. And those singular backs are coming from teams that may not split their backfield up. We have a lot of evidence showing that Bill Belichick's teams split up their backfields. Maybe that won't happen this year. Maybe that changes. But no player since 2011 on New England has had a 45% running back rush share and a 4% target share. 24 different running backs did that last year alone. The team may score a good number of running back points in fantasy, but the chance that that's coming from one back is pretty small. That's why they're priced where they're priced. Basically what I'm saying here, if you want upside from that backfield, just draft Ramondre Stevenson. We've seen Damian Harris not be deployed as a pass-catching back so far in his career, whereas Stevenson flashed some of that upside last season, and he did that in college too. He's a bigger back who can catch passes out of the backfield. I actually prefer Ramondre Stevenson this year straight up more than Damian Harris. That's been reflected in my rankings for weeks now. You mentioned in the question that it feels like you lock in an RB2 with upside, but using 2 decently high draft picks on running backs from the exact same team inherently lowers your team's upside. It's a floor play. It's not a ceiling play. So I would not do something like this. The next question this week is from Patreon. It's from Zubaz and Blue Cheese. Ready to pump late round fantasy football advice into my veins this season. Every year there seems to be an offense that is bigly overrated and super duper underrated by consensus analysts and media. Any offenses that fall under each of those categories as you did your projections? So for the underrated offense, I'm going to go with Jacksonville. I think there's a decent chance that Urban Meyer was that bad. The weapons aren't amazing in Jacksonville, but the wide receivers are fine. I think Christian Kirk is actually a value right now. And they've got threats out of the backfield. Trevor Lawrence was one of the best quarterback prospects of the last decade. Teams who did as poorly as Jacksonville did last year offensively tend to rebound. There is some nice regression there. So I'd expect them to be better offensively this year. And then as for a team that's overrated, I think the market is generally being reasonable with offenses on that side of things. I may go with Pittsburgh though. I think there's this idea that with a different quarterback, the Steelers will definitely be better offensively because there's no Ben Roethlisberger. Ben Roethlisberger's been holding them back. And he has. He wasn't great the last few seasons in Pittsburgh. But it's been kind of a fantasy-friendly offense. They've been second in passing volume over the last couple of seasons, and while they weren't great at scoring touchdowns last year, they were 13th in 2020. I talked about my feelings surrounding Deontay Johnson on Monday's show, and I'm generally below the market on Najee Harris this year too. And a lot of that is driven by the situation there in Pittsburgh. This next question is from Patreon. It's from Lee. It says, "Hi, JJ. As someone who owns the first overall pick in 2 Superflex leagues, I was terrified to see Josh Allen appear in your players to avoid list this week. I know that's geared towards his cost in a normal redraft league, but do you have any new concerns that would impact when you take him in a Superflex draft? I'm considering taking him in both leagues, but wondering if I should diversify. Thanks, and as always, love the show. Now remember, the entire argument against Josh Allen on Monday's episode in particular isn't really about Josh Allen. It's about his cost in relation to other quarterbacks in fantasy football. That all changes in Superflex because the gap in cost between Allen and those other quarterbacks, it shrinks dramatically. And for the record, my Superflex redraft rankings, they're on the Late Round Fantasy Football Patreon. Like the other quarterbacks, though, who have QB1 overall upside, the Jalen Hurts and the Kyler Murrays of the world, they're going to be first-round picks in Superflex leagues, or at the very least, early second-round picks. So you don't have this luxury of just waiting around for them a few rounds later like you do in a single quarterback league. If you'd rather go CMC or Jonathan Taylor, that's fine. But I have Josh Allen as the 101 in Superflex this year. If you're in a Superflex league in general, especially in the back half, I think going quarterback does make a lot of sense. We've seen a lot better predictability at the position over the last couple of years, and the drop-off has occurred around that QB 12 spot or so. And that seems pretty similar here in 2022 when we look at projections. So I think locking in those spots is totally reasonable. I've been building Superflex rosters that way so far during this draft season. If you want to check out one of my most recent ones, it's on my Twitter account. You can hit me up at LateRoundQB. But I've been a fan of those kinds of builds. There's a lot more to all of this, and I don't want to get too far off topic here, but Josh Allen is absolutely fine as the 101 in Superflex. The last question this week is from Twitter's from @ManWithTakes. We've all seen the glowing reports about A.J. Brown in camp. We know the talent is there, and then he has great chemistry with the quarterback. And finally, this weekend, we saw a friendlier pass-to-run ratio for Philly in the first preseason game. Why are people fading A.J. Brown into round 3? So first off, I wouldn't necessarily look too far into the pass rate for Philly in this past week's preseason game. They probably want to test some things out and see what the passing game is all about. With that being said, I absolutely expect them to be more pass heavy. So I'm with you there. I'm also with you on A.J. Brown being an awesome player. The reason he's usually a round 3 guy, though, is twofold. Number one, there's some good competition in general in the first 2 rounds of fantasy drafts. That naturally pushes him down. Number 2, Dallas Goedert and Devontae Smith are really good players. Devontae Smith had a really underrated rookie season. Among all of the 50 target rookie wide receivers since 2011, Smith's yards per route run rate was in the top 30. And the players ahead of him were almost all very good at football. Like objectively. Like they were very productive after their rookie season. Dallas Goedert last season was tied for first among tight ends in yards per route run. His 2.34 yards per route run rate was 15th best among all 50-plus target tight ends since 2011. And there's still some concern that Philly isn't like a top half team in terms of pass rate, in terms of passing volume. And then you bring on the concerns of Hurts as a passer, this competition, and then the fact that there are some really good options in that late second round of drafts. It's easier to see why Brown is being drafted where he is. But let me be clear here. I have no problem if you want to draft A.J. Brown this year. I'm just showing you the other side and answering this question. If you want to go after A.J. Brown, go for it. I love the Eagles' offense this season. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Make sure to check out LateRound.com, especially if you have a draft coming up, which I know a lot of you guys do. The Late Round Draft Guide can help you out tremendously with that, but the Patreon can too. There's also the free newsletter where I send all of my written content. Take care, everyone. Really appreciate you listening. I'll catch you next week.